But the problem I have with free market capitalism, Larry, which is your philosophy, is not with the concept. In fact, PIMCO is an epitome of its historical thrust. We're very successful, and because of free market capitalism. But the problem I have is with its apparent exhaustion in the face of three equally dynamic economic influences. Let me mention them briefly. First of all, globalization has weakened American and developed economies by siphoning off investment and, more importantly, jobs to emerging nations at 1/10 the wage cost. Take China, for example. Free market capitalism, in other words, is working for China, it's working for Brazil, but it's not working for America or Euroland. Secondly, and just briefly, free market capitalism depends on a balanced market between labor and capital. And clearly we're reaching a point where impoverished Main Street cannot afford to buy the goods that capitalism so magnificently produces. So I think there's an exhaustion here in terms of free market capitalism that has worked so well for 20 to 30 to 40, 50 years, but now is reaching structural impediments that prevent, strong growth that we're used to. I'm suggesting that the high probability is for interest rates to stay low for a long time. I mean, Byron Wien basically is a mean reversion, cyclical type of analyst. What we're suggesting is that there are structural impediments to the U.S. economy, to developed market economies that will prevent growth in the 3 to 4% category. Let me ask you, in terms of consumerism, in terms of the U.S. consumer, if unemployment stays at 9% plus, and if real wage gains are non-existent, then where is the spending power coming from? It has to come from the consumer as opposed to businesses. Businesses are waiting on the consumer. The consumer is waiting on business. We have what we call a liquidity trap. So what we're suggesting is not a reversion to the mean, not a cyclical upthrust, but basically a structural impediment that produces growth in the 0 to 2% category for a long time, not just in the U.S., but in Euroland as well.
All right, last one. I want to come back to where you were on the breakdown of free market capitalism, which is fair enough. I would acknowledge that America's economy has been on a decline now for about 10 years. But I ask you, Bill, everybody's so profitable. Businesses are so profitable. There's so much cash. Banks have more liquidity than they know what to do with. Is it possible there's a buyer strike, that there's a capital strike, that the spending and taxing and regulatory threats out of Washington are really the problem, not the free market capitalist system?
Well, I'd have to say that doesn't help. I mean, let's come together on that point. That regulation and too much of it, that taxation in terms of the necessary reforms that probably lie ahead, don't help either in terms of the current economic environment. What I would say in terms of corporate tax reform is, yes, let's reform taxes, let's reform corporate taxes, and let's reform individual taxes. But at the same token, let's not lower them, because corporate taxes are 10% of total federal revenues. They're at an all-time low, Larry, and to suggest that corporations are the poor baby in this particular story, I think is an absurdity.
And Nouriel, you do say that the risk of recession is now at 60%. What could keep us from that? What can the Fed do at this point?
Well, first of all, we have reached a stall speed in the economy, not just the U.S., but also in the Eurozone, the U.K., the most advanced economy. So we see a probability of a 60% probability of a recession next year. And unfortunately, we're running out of policy tools. Every country is doing fiscal austerity, and there is going to be a fiscal drag. The ability to backstop the banks is now impossible because of political constraints, and sovereigns cannot anymore bail out their own distressed banks because they're distressed themselves. Everybody would like a weaker currency, but in equilibrium, if the currency is weaker, the other has to be stronger. And there'll be more monetary easing, more quantitative easing done by the Fed and other central banks, but the credit channel is broken. Most of the extra base money is going into reserves, so that's not having an effect. A weakening of the dollar.
Velocity in the money.
The velocity has collapsed, and therefore all the extra base money is hoarded by the banks as excess reserves. And last year it had an effect in terms of asset reflation, but the asset reflation occurred because the economic numbers in August started to improve even before QE was done. This time around, the macro data are all on the downside. They're negative rather than positive. So yes, the last few days, the markets are rallying on expectation there will be QE. 3 done probably September 21st, but I think there's going to be a short-lived rally. And when the macro data, ISM, employment, consumption, housing, are going to come out worse and worse and worse, the market is going to start to correct again. So we are going towards a recession. We're already at stall speed, and we are running out of policy rabbits or policy bullets.
My diagnosis is, this is not just a kind of a temporary cyclical problem we happen to have run up against unexpectedly, but this is a crisis of capitalism that happens once in a generation. Because we ain't going to create demand in our economies which will help us get over the debt problem if we just go down the austerity route. The issue really is whether we are so vulnerable to another contraction that just a small shock could tip us over the edge. And I think it's very likely over the next 6 to 9 months that that'll happen. And then the circumstances will have changed, because as well as many people know very well that the employment market in the United States and other rich countries is very, very poor. There are levels of detail that go far beyond the unemployment rate, which speak to enormous social dislocation. And this is really the problem that I think we have to address. And I think it's not good enough, to be honest, for us just to turn a blind eye and say we have to get government spending out of the way, because actually government spending is part of the solution, not part of the problem. What I'm trying to describe here, and what I'm trying to help people try to understand, this is what we're going through is a once-in-a-generation shock in our capitalist system. This is not just, as I said before, a temporary aberration. So what has to happen? I think we have to, basically, we have to see the whites of the eyes of another recession or contraction and a further, significant increase in the unemployment rate for people to understand what needs to happen.
As soon as policymakers realize we're facing a once-in-a-lifetime crisis of capitalism, well, the better equipped they'll be to find a way out of it. So what can we learn from Marx? Well, he once wrote, the ultimate reason of all real crises always remains the poverty and restricted consumption of the masses. A statement that Magnus says is as relevant today as many of Marx's other predictions.
Thanks. So was Marx right after all?
Well, I mean, I think by now, we know very well that he wasn't right, and actually his predictions about what would happen to the capitalist system proved way off the mark. But his analysis of how the capitalist system works actually bears some very uncanny likenesses to what we see going on today. The credit boom, the bust, the revelation of inequality, the kind of full exposure of how weak our labor markets are, the lack of growth drivers. I mean, all of these things actually are very Marxist, if you want to put it that way, in terms of the diagnosis of what ails us today. Well, I think personally, of all of these steps, obviously some of them are politically, the time for these things hasn't arrived yet, and things may have to get worse before policymakers will embrace them. But I think that employment is, above all, and should be the litmus test of everything that governments, think about and do. I'm not saying that these things are going to magically work overnight, but actually the alternative is also not acceptable. A lot of the focus at the moment is, are we going to go back into recession or, back into another contraction? I mean, my view is that we never left the first one. I mean, it's still with us. We just had a bit of a bungee jump out of the abyss, but we're still in a very, very serious position. And I think that if we do have faltering growth or negative growth over the next 2 or 3 quarters, obviously unemployment numbers, labour market data will get worse, and there'll be a lot of pressure on governments to respond. John Maynard Keynes basically articulated for us how capitalism can save itself. Cutting taxes, if that's what people would like to do, top rates of tax or whatever, value-added tax. These things, I think, won't really work because in a household deleveraging, people will simply use the extra money to either pay off their credit cards, put down payments off against mortgage debt and so on. So what you really need is you need to keep growth going. And the only way you can do that is by widening the employment base, because more people at work means more income, more tax revenues, more consumption. And we need to do things that will encourage private sector job creation.
I think that what happened in the 1980s and the 1990s was a sense that too many people were being left behind. And of course, the political process responds. Now, how do you help people whose incomes aren't growing? Well, you try and retrain them, you try and educate them, but that's really difficult. and it takes a long time. The next possible alternative was credit, and that's often the alternative found in developing countries. By giving people who are falling behind easy credit, you allow them to consume, and after all, consumption matters as much, if not more, than incomes. And if you also give them a housing credit, maybe they look at the house price, see it increase, feel themselves better off, are allowed to borrow against that house price to fund consumption. And the fact that the incomes are stagnating doesn't matter so much. I argue that housing credit and the push towards low-income housing credit was a palliative, a way to take people's attention off the deeper problem that incomes were stagnating, and it worked. It worked for the Republicans. It created more homeowners who typically tend to vote Republican. It worked for the Democrats. It created more flows towards their natural constituency. Both supported it in a big way. President Clinton through affordable housing initiatives, President Bush through what he called the Ownership Society. Tons of money was poured into low-income lending by various quasi-government agencies and government agencies. And to my mind, that helped the process of creating what we've now got, which is an unholy mess in the housing sector. When it's all about jobs, the kinds of policies that are undertaken can be extreme and may not have the intent. If the corporations aren't hiring, but you're pushing very hard on every button that you have, fiscal stimulus, monetary stimulus, job owning, everything you're doing, sometimes that can go in the wrong direction. You find that many people within the banks understood fully well what was going on, and yet they went along. The push towards low-income housing, the extreme degree of stimulus given by the Fed, the willingness to intervene if the system got into trouble, and the flows coming in from outside, all of them combined essentially to give the financial system the incentive, which was primarily of the kind, if we bet and take more risk, we make tons of money. If we lose, somebody else will pick up the pieces. And what I argue is in 2002, 2003, 2004, the Fed was on hold, kept interest rates really, really low because it was worried that jobs weren't coming back. What's happened since 1991 is we've had what are called jobless recoveries. It took 23 months for the jobs lost in the recession to come back in 1991. It took 38 months, 3.25 years, for the jobs to come back in 2001. By most estimates, this current recession, it'll take longer than 3.25 years, maybe 5 years. Well, if you think about it that way, what's 6 months of unemployment benefits when you're looking at 5 years worth of unemployment? Unemployment benefits expire after 6 months. Most people have healthcare benefits tied to jobs until the recent bill, and that's not going to kick in for another 4 or 5 years. So the real problem is that people who lose their jobs have tremendous amounts of anxiety because, coupled with the low savings, they really have nothing to fall back on. That's why I argue maybe we ought to think about extending the safety net to something which makes more sense, given the nature of recoveries has changed, because that will allow for calmer, more sensible policies.
There are concerns that a lack of leadership and competing economic interests have left the global economy as vulnerable as ever. We have rules against subsidies, for instance, yet the United States continues to subsidize its farmers at the expense of farmers in the developing world.
That there is a narrative that the United States talks about in terms of we need a level playing field with rule of law and transparency. But a lot of folks in the emerging market world say, wait a second, you've created globalization over the last 40 years with rules that you created that benefit Western-based multinational corporations. They've been reaching out, they've taken our labor, they've taken our goods, they've made the bulk of the profits, and now that we're coming into our own, and our own corporations are doing much better, we're trying to use our legal system with our sorts of rules so that that playing field will start to shift in our favor. You're saying you don't like it. Now, at least, in Europe, you've got a crisis right now, but people are being honest that the economics have become zero-sum. There's divergence, not convergence, and either the Germans and French are going to pay, or the Greeks, the Spaniards, and the Portuguese are going to pay, but it's zero-sum. The pie is only so big, someone has to pay. Between the West and the developing world, there is a rebalancing that is occurring. You've had convergence, you're moving towards divergence, but instead we're talking about the G20, we're talking about win-win. We need to be honest with ourselves that we are in a more zero-sum economic environment. We need to be honest that we're in a G0. Let's set expectations realistically so we can actually build from a reasonable base.
International oil corporations used to be able to go to a dictator, cut a nice deal with him, throw him some millions of dollars, put a straw in the land, and take cash out. Just suck cash right out of the country. Worked very well for them until the dictators realized that they could create their own straws. National oil corporations. Now 13 of the 15 largest oil corporations in terms of reserve size. They are not companies in the private sector. They are national oil corporations. When we talk about big oil, we're really talking about states, as it turns out, right? So if you were an IOC, you suddenly were out of the straw business. And that meant that you had to either do something different, like move towards management and technology, one of the things that ExxonMobil has successfully done, or you lose. Failure is an option, right? And I think that what Western multinationals investing in China, Steve Ballmer among them, and probably Goldman Sachs soon, are going to have to realize that the old way of doing business is going to put them directly in confrontation with the state. So they're going to have to adapt or they're going to lose. And some of them will adapt. Some of them will lose. And I don't think we're quite conscious of that yet.
My argument is that what we saw then with oil, we are now seeing in many sectors, in aviation and technology and telecom.
So we're getting
state capitalism itself in this manifestation is pretty new in the way that it's using these tools of the free market. But there's no question that it had its origins in mercantilism, 18th and 19th centuries, where you did have effective unity between states and a lot of key corporate actors, the East India Company, trading company, for example, which basically operated as an arm of government and took advantage of investment opportunities in that way. Now, people didn't think about free trade. And they certainly didn't have free currency flows in the way that you do today. So mercantilism was really a very early precursor of the state capitalism we have right now. But there's no question that you see that happening.
What distinguishes state capitalism from mercantilism?
Well, again, I think the big difference is that you have governments now that are actually actively using pricing mechanisms and tools of contemporary markets, of globalized markets, for their own political outcomes.
The economic conflict is increasingly what security is all about. I mean, when you have cyber espionage that's being supported by governments going after the corporate secrets and technology, whether you're talking about big oil and gas firms, whether you're talking about technology firms, whether you're talking about Google, that is increasingly hitting at the heart of the vitality of these countries.
The Chinese increasingly don't need the West the way they did before. They used to need foreign direct investment dollars. They don't anymore. They have the investment. They used to need Western technology. They've stolen and developed a lot of that, and the West doesn't want to bring in a lot of what they have brought in the past because they're losing it. And in addition to all of that, you have the Chinese recognizing that they cannot count on the West to consume their exports the way they used to. So the Chinese want to decouple. It's going to take a long time, but that's the strategy. And so between the United States and China, the world's two largest economies, there is actually a war between state capitalism and the free market. The systems are fundamentally incompatible. China America is a joke.
It's a joke.
No one ever should have talked about a G2. It is a system where there are some zero-sum components and there are some positive-sum components, but in the last 18 months, the zero-sum components have become more important. And on every major issue, whether we're talking about Iran or Taiwan or the Dalai Lama or currency or cybersecurity or trade or intellectual property or the environment, on every single one, the U.S.-China relationship is in worse shape than it was 2 years ago, and it's deteriorating. In the case of the relationship between the U.S. and China, if China fails, we have serious problems, and yet if they really succeed with the system, we have serious problems. So this is a very tough one to manage. The world as a whole over the last 40 years had been governed by an increasingly global free market system. That was the dominant economic paradigm. We've hit the tipping point on that. There is now a competing system. It's real. It's state capitalism, It's a system where the state is the principal actor in the economy, uses the markets for ultimately political gains, and there's no rule of law. If there is a war between a state and a corporation, the corporation loses.
You're flagging China that it could experience some instability as it opens up.
More than some.
Do you still believe that?
Of course.
When's it going to happen?
The point is
besides
that
the 10,000 or
in the
100,000
last 2 years, they've stopped opening up. The Chinese government had been incrementally opening their economy over the past 20, 30 years, but not once the economic crisis hit. And we need to recognize that we've now given them the ability, not just for He Yafei to talk to me, but for the Chinese government to tell their people, we can't support. Look what happened with the free market. It's America's fault. And all these free market capitalists that the economy is in the situation that it is, right?
So it's a coping mechanism.
We've really set, in other words, if you had believed that there was a possibility that the Chinese model was maybe unsustainable in 5 to 10 years, if you believed that 2 years ago, you better be pushing that back now, because they've just given themselves an extraordinary lease on life.
Do I believe that the West is going to engage in more economic populism, nationalism as a response to a structural change in who has access and availability to wealth and consumption capacity? Yes, I do. A world where the emerging markets are going to start doing most of the consuming and most of the growth is a world that will be fundamentally more conflict-laden, more violent, less ethical. There are implications of that.
There are many countries that if you were to put a democratic system in place, it would be much, much worse for that country. Think about the elections that we've just had in Afghanistan. Never should have happened. The country was not ready for democracy. Smart governance in that country would have told you don't have democratic elections. I believe that a properly regulated free market economy, properly regulated, not what we've seen in the last few years, is the most effective, or at least worst, economic system that the world has seen. And yet, if you take that system and you suddenly put it into a country that is authoritarian, that has state capitalism, you could do extraordinary damage to that country's stability and globally. It is probably right for the Chinese officials not to want to move quickly to a free market economy today. And I hate to say it, but it may even be right for the United States to support that. In a state capitalist society, right, the government wants to have as much growth as possible. And they also want political stability. But when they're forced to choose, they choose political stability. That is important to recognize. In Abu Dhabi today, you have sovereign wealth funds. They are not trying to maximize returns. They were before the crisis. Now they're much more economically constrained, and they have this massive problem in Dubai. It doesn't make a difference what kind of returns they make. They're putting their money in Dubai first. If you're China, you must secure commodities all over the world for your people and your growth. And it doesn't matter if it's an authoritarian state, and it doesn't matter if that's maybe not the most rational, efficient use of that currency today and those surpluses today, because you understand that you need that or you're going to have serious political problems domestically. So as you find that things are constrained, that you have to make choices, that you have priorities, the Chinese care enormously about environmental degradation. They do. It's a priority. They want to move to alternative energy. They're doing it. But the priority is economic growth. More than that. Why? Because the priority is political stability that requires that growth. That growth has to happen every year, every quarter. And so as a consequence, they're continuing to engage in this extraordinary degradation of their environment. All of these things create unsustainability over the long term. But it's the long term. In a country with 1.3 billion people, with extraordinary capacity to continue to leverage the productive capacity of those people, much more than any other country in the world today, they can make a lot of mistakes, and they can be less efficient, and they can still grow quite a bit.
You have sovereign wealth funds. You have national champions, which is very interesting. So states point to a company and say, you're our guy, and we're going to use you.
Not owned by the state. Doesn't have to be. Baidu. Right? I mean, Google's problem in China was with a private company. Just so happened the private company was supported by the Chinese government and Google wasn't.
Why is
that
that?
Position. Well, I mean, a couple of reasons. I mean, first of all, because there are connections, of course, politically that are effective within the government, and that always matters in authoritarian states, always matters. Secondly, because there's a lot of mistrust that a company like Google, connected with the U.S. government, they, sort of provide a lot of data on counterterrorism, for example, security to the National Security Agency. There are a lot of fundamental questions in China, in the government and among Chinese, that what Google is doing with that data that they are collecting on all of these Chinese searches is probably not in China's national interest. And even if they're not using it in a malevolent way today, who's to say they won't in the future? Why wouldn't China want control of that? The Chinese system is doing incredibly well. But as you ask long term, do we think that that system, that authoritarian system with the massive environmental degradation that's going on, with the troubled labor and demographic issues that will be coming down the pike, are they, with the problems with indigenous innovation and entrepreneurship, especially when they're going to be more in confrontation with the West, who do I want to bet on? Ultimately, the safer bet is the West. There's no question. But it's not as safe as a bet as it would have been 5 years ago.
We're not all Egyptians, no matter what sort of the folks on CNN or in the New York Times might say. And there's a huge difference between a country like Egypt with sort of unemployment that is a dramatic issue and growth that just can't keep up with these guys, and food inflation that's massive on the economic front, to some of the major oil producers and energy producers like Qatar, like Kuwait, like Saudi Arabia, where per capita incomes are vastly greater, sort of where food is a much smaller percentage of direct expenditure, and where a lot of the employment comes in and out from countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh. So clearly this is a very momentous period in the historic arc of challenges to authoritarian regimes that started with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the independence of the East Bloc countries. We're now seeing in Egypt, but let's not suddenly think that we're going to see quote-unquote contagion across the entire region.
But the United States is very much a taker, not a maker of foreign policy right now.
Take me back to a point that America perhaps was at its strongest, the end of World War II. We were the victor. It was, if anything, the next 50 years would be a solidification of the American century.
You know, it's interesting that people all remember the 1950s and 60s as the golden age of the American middle class, and it absolutely was. But it's important to remember what the preconditions were. 1945, the rest of the world has been destroyed. I mean, in some cases quite literally. And the most important manufacturing centers of the world, which were in Europe and to a lesser extent in Japan, had been totally destroyed. We're the only ones with a manufacturing capacity left. We loan money to the rest of the world, or give it in some cases, as in the Marshall Plan, and help rebuild their economies. They start buying from us. This is when American brands go global. I mean, Coca-Cola followed the American soldier into every combat theater in the world. And this provides enormous jobs for people, and this is when the unions can pad jobs, and they can say we're going to have 5 people for every job that's necessary, and they get enormous benefits. This is the 50s, 60s. By the early 1970s, Europe is back on its feet, particularly countries like Germany. Japan has moved up, South Korea has moved up, and we begin to face the first serious threats of competitors. And this causes an enormous amount of both anxiety and there's a slump, and Americans think, how do we start getting out of this? And that's when you begin the story that everyone is telling. And you will notice that almost everyone begins the story really in the last 30 years. Right. But it's important to remember the previous 30 years were a very unnatural period. The rest of the world wasn't playing this game.
You talk about 2 things. One is technology and globalization. How did that impact where we are today?
The technology part is particularly important to talk about because everyone has some sense of what globalization means. The technology part is crucial. In the 1970s, 1980s, you had information technology, but remember, not a lot of it. Most of us were using electric typewriters, and that's what we meant by a technology. When computers were used, they were used to help the payroll systems, the back offices. Didn't really add much to the efficiency or productivity. By the 1990s, and it's really the late 1990s, information technology starts affecting every area of business. Sales, marketing, retail, everything is transformed by information technology. And now all of a sudden, you can do a lot with many, many fewer people everywhere in the organization. Jack Welch has this example that I give, which is extraordinary. Company that he's involved in that has 28,000 employees and $12 billion of revenue. This was in 2007. It'll get back to $12 billion in 2 years, but with 14,000 employees. So it's a 50% pay cut, a workforce cut to produce the same revenues.
I have heard story after story where companies, because of the economic crisis, had to tighten their belt. And all of a sudden they realized that they can be more efficient and more productive without the same amount of investment in people or plants. I mean, the challenge for us in restoring the American dream is what?
I think the key challenge is how do you provide reasonable employment opportunities for the vast majority of Americans. I think we all know that the top 10% of America is going to do fine. They surf this world of globalization and technology. They benefit from it. It's a win-win.
And they get 50% of the income.
Right, and part of that is for reasons that Steve Pearlstein was talking about, which is that the gains for talent have become much greater than the gains for capital. In the 1920s, the way you became rich was you had access to capital. After a while, people realized the world was awash in capital by the 1960s or 70s. What you needed was talent. But I do think that you have this growing polarization. But the heart of the problem is, how do you provide jobs for tens of millions of people with all these competitive pressures? What do you do? We've done a lot of government spending, a huge amount, on consumption. What people don't realize is one of the reasons governments can't afford anything, one of the reasons that Governor Christie thinks he can't afford to build a new tunnel between New Jersey and New York, is because the New Jersey state budget is mostly now devoted to pensions, health care for state employees. This is a huge part of the budget of every major government, everywhere.
So, but that's
consumption expenditure.
That's a huge problem. So, but what's the answer to that because of the commitment made to the workers and the pension programs that they believe were coming to them?
In every Western country, they have started scaling back those commitments. And I think there are various ways to do it, which is to say, for those of you within 10 years of retirement or 15 years of retirement, it could reasonably be said that you are going to expect these benefits, and so we'll keep them for you. But for everybody else, we begin scaling them back. There's another way, which is to do co-pays and things like that. In some ways, we may have stumbled upon the kind of genetic defect in democracy, which is it massively overpowers and privileges the present compared to the future. Because if you think of the Republicans and the Democrats, the one thing they agree on is subsidizing the present. The Republicans do it through tax cuts, and the Democrats do it through consumption spending of particularly health care and pensions. People forget the government of the United States created the semiconductor industry. It created modern computer science. It created the internet. These were all government-sponsored, funded.
But will we be creating the jobs, the industries of the future unless we make some significant decisions now?
And we didn't.
And significant investments now.
And this was the tragedy of Obama's first 2 years, in that he had started out on the right track, and then the nature of the political process took that first stimulus, $800 billion of it. Remember, a third of it went to a tax cut. Completely pointless. This was the only way to get the Republicans on board, but still, people forget, this was the third tax cut initiated since the crisis, and people, of course, were not going to spend it because they were rational and decided they needed to repair their balance sheets. A third of it went to local and state governments to prevent them from laying off people. Fine, but it's all consumption spending. Only a third of it, maybe even less, was actually what we think of when we think of a stimulus, which is a 1930s style massive infrastructure projects that will create a new interstate highway system and things like that. So it ended up being, for a $14 trillion economy, you're talking about maybe $200 billion.
What is the strategy for the United States in terms of its relationship with the New World Order and its strategy for a New World Order?
I think people clearly still want American leadership, partly out of habit, partly out of a sense that nobody else knows who would be the leader, and you certainly see over the last month a real apprehension in Asia about China and about what Chinese leadership would look like because of the way the Chinese rattle the saber over the South China Seas with the Japanese. They've done it with the Vietnamese. So there is, I think in political terms, Obama has actually helped change the equation for the United States. But that sense that America was the future, that sense that Arianna talked about thinking of America as being the future, that really has changed. And it's not anything that America has done to a large extent, it's that these countries have risen.
The daddy of all central bankers was Alan Greenspan. As head of America's Federal Reserve, his pronouncements on interest rates made headlines around the world. The models never forecast recession because the parameters are dominated by what happens in normal times when the economy is growing. As the economy crumbled, Greenspan confessed to Congress in tortured language. I discovered a flaw in the model that I perceived as the critical functioning structure that defines how the world works. I was shocked. We handsomely reward economists who claim to fine-tune the economy to keep it stable, but when boom turns to bust, they escape into mysticism. They claim, quote, occasional slowdowns are natural and necessary features of a market economy. The people we trust to keep the economy on an even keel have no idea what makes the market economy explode. Illusion. The problem lies with some of the theories used by economists. They simply don't reflect the real world. They are fictions invented to explain an imaginary market economy. So when the economy overheats, the mathematical equations they have concocted turn out to be useless. Economists here at the Bank of England also failed to forecast the end of the business cycle. They confess that their economic models break down when the going gets tough. Rachel Lomax, as Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, confessed,
when it comes to quantifying the effect of changes in credit conditions, our workhorse economic models still cannot help us very much.
Those of us who have looked to the self-interest of lending institutions to protect shareholders' equity, myself especially, are in a state of shocked disbelief.
I'm shocked to find that gambling is going on in here. You're winning, sir. Oh, thank you very much. Everybody out at once.
It didn't take long for Bourne to learn that she and the chairman were not going to see eye to eye.
He said something to the effect of, well, Brooksley, we're never going to agree on fraud. And she said, well, what do you mean? And he said, you probably think there should be rules against it. She said, well, yes, I do. He said, you know, I think the market will figure it out and take care of the fraudsters.
The Alan Greenspan lunch, did it actually happen? Where he says...
I'm not going to talk about it. I'm not going to talk about it on camera.
Greenspan didn't believe that fraud was something that needed to be enforced, and he assumed she probably did. And of course she did. I've never met a financial regulator who didn't feel that fraud was part of their mission. That was her introduction to Alan Greenspan.
The clash with Greenspan didn't intimidate Bourne. She was determined that her agency would investigate fraud at the first opportunity. One area that caught her attention was a new and highly lucrative market, over-the-counter derivatives.
She starts to realize that there's this whole world out there of what are called over-the-counter derivatives that are essentially unregulated. It's not even that they're unregulated, it's that the government doesn't even know what's going on.
My staff began to say how big this was and how little information they had about it.
On Wall Street, they described it as a black box. Only the parties involved in a deal knew what was happening.
Derivatives, in essence, are insurance policies that various players on Wall Street enter into to protect themselves from unforeseen calamities.
It was a $27 trillion market, happening out of sight, inside a black box.
We didn't truly know the dangers in the market because it was a dark market. There was no transparency.
The conditions were very favorable for things to go wrong.
As Bourne's investigators learned, there was also plenty of room for old-fashioned fraud. Looking inside Wall Street's black box was impossible for Bourne, or indeed any other government regulator.
They're unregulated. The contracts aren't traded on exchanges. They're entered into between private parties.
There was no record-keeping requirement imposed on participants in the market. There was no reporting. We had no information.
There's no way, really, for the government or anyone else to know how many of these are out there, know how big a market it is, and know who owns them and who owes who money, because it's just a bunch of contracts in file cabinets in the lawyers' offices of banks and hedge funds all over the world.
And that's what frightened Bourne more than anything. Trillions of dollars and the biggest banks in the country operating in secret. If something went terribly wrong, the high-stakes derivatives market could take down the entire financial system.
And that's what everybody's worried about. You have one big institution that fails. It can't pay its obligations. It forces somebody else into a dangerous territory who can't pay their obligations. And pretty soon it's a falling domino effect through the economy.
As the market grew and morphed, Bourne felt her agency would have to get involved. But that would mean confronting Greenspan, Rubin, and Summers.
She used to say she would lay awake at night, turning in her bed, because she could see, coming down the road, the crises kept building and building.
But at Treasury, things were about to change. The carefully calibrated inner tranquility was being disturbed by a small tremor. It quickly made its way up to Robert Rubin. Brooksley Bourne was contemplating the regulation of OTC derivatives.
The pushback is visceral and immediate. And that's one of the striking things about this.
This was a job for Larry Summers.
I walk into Brooksley's office one day. The blood is drained from her face. She's hanging up the telephone. She says to me, "That was Larry Summers."
Larry basically reads her the riot act. He more or less tells her, my understanding is that you don't get it.
He says you're going to cause the worst financial crisis since the end of World War II, that he has, my memory is, 13 bankers in his office who have informed him of this. Stop. Right away. No more.
In Washington, they say the financial sector has 5 lobbyists for every congressman.
Brooksley Bourne is stepping into the maw of the most well-oiled and highly financed lobby in the history of Washington, D.C. It's the financial lobby.
Bankers just fall over themselves, calling Summers and Rubin and Greenspan and everybody, saying, "Get this lady off our backs."
But the harder they pushed, the more interested Bourne became.
They were totally opposed to it. That puzzled me. You know, what was it that was in this market that had to be hidden? Why did it have to be a completely dark market? So it made me very suspicious and troubled.
Bourne's agency was legally independent. She reported to the president. Rubin had no authority over her. To stop her, he would call upon his allies who sat with him on a secretive council known as the President's Working Group.
The President's Working Group was the most influential White House body on financial policy.
It was called at the discretion of the Secretary of the Treasury.
It was a committee handpicked by Bob Rubin, and it was a committee that he steered.
Larry Summers attended. So did Alan Greenspan. And the chairman of the SEC, Arthur Levitt.
Alan and Bob and I had known one another and away from government. I think we all liked one another and respected one another.
By executive order, the head of the CFTC also attended the meetings.
I didn't know Brooksley Bourne. I was told that she was irascible, difficult, stubborn, unreasonable.
Rubin, Summers, and Greenspan had a great deal of faith in their own intellects. And I think that they were not welcoming of somebody who looked at the world different and was kind of abrasive.
As Rubin was quietly preparing the working group, Bourne was taking the first steps toward regulating OTC derivatives, designing a document known as a concept release. In response, Rubin acted. calling an emergency meeting of the working group.
We're driven there, and we get out at the entrance to the Treasury, go up to the room, everybody assembles, the secretary walks in, the meeting is called to order. And the subject of the meeting was to discuss the concept release, and the clear mission of it was to convince Brooksley that it shouldn't be issued.
What's amazing is that Rubin and Greenspan said, no, 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 you can't do that. We just can't have this. And it got pretty nasty pretty quickly.
Those on the other side were saying, look, this deregulated market is part of what's brought us the boom times. And so we don't want to change that. You know, the market will take care of everything. And we really don't need regulation of these. And in fact, it would be counterproductive.
Rubin was condescending toward her. He said he would get his lawyer in the department to help her understand the laws better, something like that.
And then it was Alan Greenspan's turn.
I happened to be sitting behind Brooksley and behind Greenspan. They're sitting next to each other. Greenspan turns to her, she turns to him. His face is red, and he's clearly quite upset. He was very adamant that this was a serious, serious mistake, that it caused untold damages to the financial services market, and that she should stop and not do this, that it was unwise and would cause tremendous damage.
In a group of this kind, there will be a disparity in power, and it would take an extraordinarily outspoken, knowledgeable, pugnacious person to fight the losing battle against the titans who led that group.
It's the education of Brooksley Born. They decided that, hey, she's not playing ball. We're going to teach her a lesson. And we're going to get this thing killed because we don't want it to happen.
I see no evidence whatsoever to suggest that this is a troubled market, that fraud is rampant.
The release has cast the shadow of regulatory uncertainty over a thriving market.
The CFTC's action has and will bring, I believe, significant disruption to this important global market.
It serves no useful purpose, hinders the efficiency of markets to enlarge.
All the regulators there testifying, and you know, all of them say this is a bad idea, this is a bad idea, this is a bad idea, this is a bad idea. And then she says this is a good idea, and the senators and congressmen just you know, beat her over the head.
I feel very strongly that we should not have one agency innovate in this area, and in doing so create very substantial financial problems.
90% of the members of Congress couldn't have told you what a derivative was. So all they knew was that these guys on Wall Street, some of whom make big campaign contributions, many of whom seem very smart, say if we do this, it'll screw up the economy.
My question again is, what are you trying to protect?
We're trying to protect the money of the American public, which is at risk in these markets.
As for Brooksley Born, without new regulations, she's offering another warning.
I think we will have continuing danger from these markets, and that we will have repeats of the financial crisis. May differ in details, but there will be significant financial downturns and disasters attributed to this regulatory gap over and over until we learn from experience.
The wonderful thing about fraud is that it produces guaranteed record profits. So the person at the top sets a tone that is corrupt, and he creates financial incentive structures where if you cheat, you make a lot of money. And if you don't cheat, not only do you not make a lot of money, you get in trouble. You get in trouble in the sense that you don't get your bonus because you're not producing the income, but worse, far more powerful, you keep your peers, your friends in the organization from getting their bonus. The people who have the greatest moral backbone leave. And the folks that stay become ever more used to an environment in which cheating is the norm. Pretty soon, they almost always start joking about it. They tell these people that are prospering by cheating that they're geniuses, that they're transcendent. It's like the Übermensch, transcends normal human morality because they're better and brighter than all of us. It's Darwinian, social Darwinian thought taken to the absolute max, and it degrades everything.
What really went on here was a massive Ponzi scheme with a number of players, a number of investment banks were involved in this, and what this did is phony securitizations supplied the money for fraudulent lending in the United States on a massive scale. Now, I always talk about the housing market because most people understand it, and it's the largest part of the U.S. economy. This activity did a lot of damage to the U.S. economy, and the investment banks have not been held accountable. First of all, notice what they did here. They took, a synthetic CDO, the most complicated tail end of the Ponzi scheme. What the banks really, what they should have gone after them is accounting fraud. Because at all of these firms, during the S&L crisis, there were 1,100 criminal indictments. There has been more damage to the U.S. economy as a result of this activity. The fraud was more widespread, it was much more massive, and there haven't been the criminal indictments. And that's because Wall Street has basically bought off Congress. Of course we should hold people accountable for that kind of activity, and those are the people that we want to drum out of the business.
Why is there this sort of tacit acknowledgement that they're going to let this go on, that a little bit of shady dealing is okay?
It's a matter of going after the correct issues. And I think that this is really something that we've got to clean up. And I'm not going to stay silent about it. The facts are what they are, and they're irrefutable. I looked at every single one of Merrill's deals that came to market in 2007. And before these deals closed, I said, this deal shouldn't close. It's a classic situation for fraud. The SEC should be shutting down these financial meth labs. The SEC didn't do its job. But Merrill also did not write down these securitizations. Instead, they took losers, clearly losing products, stuffed it into deals, and sold. And for Goldman, this will just be basically a traffic ticket. This is a sham, and this is a disgrace. At this point, we should be having indictments for accounting fraud. And when you go after the basic fraud, which was supplying money for fraudulent lending and packaging fraudulent loans, and basically just covering it all up by then having another securitization that was more complicated to cover up the fact that the first one was fraudulent. And that's how a Ponzi scheme works. At the end, you saw an acceleration of the most complicated product in the shortest period of time just to cover this all up. And that is a classic situation of what happens at the tail end of a Ponzi scheme. So, we should be going after all of these players. You start with the basics, and as you roll up, your discovery then will capture everyone else who is involved in it as well. But instead, what our administration has done is starved the FBI of funding. President Obama does not need to say "Mother may I" to Republicans to tell the FBI to go in there and just start their investigations and swarm all over these guys. Instead, what they did, though, is they basically starved their budget so they don't have the manpower to do it. We are being totally mocked in the United States. I think we live to entertain.
So if you understand this dynamic, I'm saying, and I'm sure people on both sides of the Fed and Goldman's and all the, if you're on the inside of Wall Street, you know all of this.
Right.
So what you're doing is creating the bubble because you know when to get out.
Exactly.
You'll get out, the bubble will burst, and there'll be another whack of people losing their pension funds and whatever.
Except the funny bit is that they're all telling themselves this. I mean, I even heard some of my investor friends were saying that were basically everybody, at least the investor types, and you presume the Wall Street types are thinking this way also, that the Fed's creating a bubble, we're going to ride the bubble, everybody's all in. And the problem is this was the same mentality people had in early 2007. You could tell it was going to end badly. And everybody thought that, we'll just ride it and we'll be able to get out on time, we'll be able to save our hide. Even the professionals couldn't. That's why we had a crisis. That what happens in a crisis is suddenly the number of trades and the volume of trades you can do collapses. And they can't exit. They think they can exit in time, and the reality is the exit shrinks.
What do they
and
care?
Only very few people get through.
They're going to get their bonuses. And too big to fail is still too big to fail.
Right.
So it doesn't matter what the finance reform legislation was. We know it didn't solve too big to fail, and they'll come back again.
Yeah.
So why not? What's to lose? Except the rest of the society has a lot to lose.
Well, the one thing that might happen this time, if we have a crash sooner rather than later, is people are already profoundly angry with the banks. And if we have a crisis of some type in, I would say, the next 6 to 18 months, there's going to have to be a pound of flesh for another round of bailouts. It's not going to be acceptable for there to be another round of bailouts without at least the management of major firms being fired. I mean, there will have to be some. You know, the progressive wing is certainly very unhappy with Obama, and yet he's delivered right-wing policies, but with enough left-wing rhetoric that the Republicans can shoot at him. They can sort of take advantage of his confused positioning versus what he's actually been up to. So I think it's just been a very bad policy.
But what I'm getting at is that if, from the point of view of small business and retired people,
right.
who, if we understand the demographics of who voted Republican and
Yeah.
especially Tea Party movement, that's a very high percentage of who makes up that movement, retired people and small business. It's not only, but they're a big piece. Aren't they going to be some of the first people to get creamed by austerity measures? And
absolutely. Well, this goes back to what Thomas Frank was saying, and that there's large segments of the population who have been persuaded for social reasons to vote against their economic interests. Unfortunately, this has become a well-established pattern with large groups within the public. And I think that part of this is that there is a big racist element in the vote against Obama. Like, I have family in Alabama, and 88% of the white people voted against Obama. The second, and there is a feeling among older white people of being sort of beleaguered, and that they're sort of losing out, that all the things that the sort of traditional middle class, if you saved, if you did the right thing, you'd have a decent retirement. That's all being pulled out from under them, and yet they've been steered to blame the wrong people for why they're.
But am I right that if you have no more government stimulus and you have smaller government,
absolutely,
what's likely to happen is deeper depression, low interest rates. So people want more interest on their retirement savings, are not going to get higher interest rates. Small business are going to have no market to sell to because there's going to be higher unemployment. So two of the pillars of this movement are going to be ones that get creamed. I mean, is the logic right?
No, your logic is absolutely correct. But I'm just saying that they've been sold. Yes, they've been sold a bill of goods.
Because they're being sold that there's going to be some economic revival at a smaller government.
I don't even know that they've really. Well, that's yes. This whole government. It's the whole.
Get regulation and government out of the way, and business will be free to invest.
And it's just not going to happen.
Okay, so I don't get this. They're going to be the retired people in small business are going to be the first one killed by what's coming.
Exactly. Well, what happened, turns out, was basically like the turkey deciding to vote for Thanksgiving.
So people better stop taking economics on faith and try to get a handle on what's really happening to them.
Exactly.
I've been the iconoclast who disagrees with all these sort of doom and gloom scenarios, and I will explain why. When I was the mortgage manager, I was there at the time when Paul Volcker drove interest rates to levels we have never seen before and never seen since. Mortgage rates went from 10% to over 20%. And these were just apocalyptic times. The mortgage delinquency ratio in Canada at that time, 1980-81, went from 0.5% to 1%. And so my argument is these people predicting doom and gloom and apocalypse do not understand that Canadian consumers have a very, very deep attachment to their house, and they will do whatever they have to do to make the payment on that mortgage. They'll default on their utility payments. They'll default on their credit card. They will default on their car payment, but they will not default on their house. I have people coming into me who are unemployed, they lost their jobs, and they made their payment every month on time. And I was astonished at where they got the money. Well, we can guess. It was the mothers and fathers and the brothers and the sisters in this country that came to the rescue privately in each family.
the only reason they got into that debt was they saw possibilities of borrowing money and gambling on rising house prices or rising share prices. Now, the days of rising house prices are clearly over. There's a form of bubble taking place in the share market, but even there it hasn't reached back to the levels it was back in 2007. And when you deflate it by inflation, it's nowhere near the level it was back in 2000. So it's a losing game, putting your money into the stock market, even though there's been a short-term rise. There's a bubble in commodities, but even that's something which actually more the big boys get a chance to play with. I'd be horrified to see if a commodity speculative boom began with the American household sector being dragged into taking out contracts to speculate on rising commodity prices forever. Because if you think share markets can fall quickly, watch what happens when commodities start falling. So it's insane to imagine there could be another debt-driven bubble. So therefore you've got to have a period of growth in the American economy which is driven by real changes in GDP, not by increasing levels of debt, and yet at the same time is going to be constrained by people's inability to invest because they have such huge debt servicing levels. Now that's the situation Japan's been in for the last 20 years. And I've really, for a long time, expected this crisis to be a bit like America turning Japanese, to take the old song. And they're turning Japanese by making exactly the same mistakes that they criticised the Japanese for making 20 years ago. And this was they said they should have shut down the zombie banks. This is what the Americans were telling the Japanese to do back in 1991-92, saying, shut down your zombie banks. They've lent too much money. They shouldn't have done it. They should be shut down. Eliminate the debt that way and start the whole system over again. Don't try to deficit spend your way out of trouble. Well, the Japanese kept the zombies alive and tried to deficit spend their way out of trouble. What are the Americans doing now? They're keeping the zombies alive. In fact, the zombies run the system. Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley and friends are dominating what's being done in economic policy in America. They're not being the zombies, they're feeding the zombies. And keeping the debt levels at those high levels while deficit spending. Now, the great irony is they've managed to attenuate the severity of the crisis by that deficit spending, which the Japanese did as well, of course. But unlike the Japanese, there's now a political consensus in America to get the government deficit down again. Now, when they start doing that, that means that the cash flow that the government sector gave that attenuated the decline is going to start being withdrawn. And when that withdrawal happens, rather than having a robust private sector economy, which is what the mainstream neoclassical economists expect, you're going to have a debt-encumbered society where, again, you'll fall back down again. And that's starting to turn up in the data as well. But it really comes down to the idea of acceleration. So if you look at the level of spending in the economy, and this is where I differ again from neoclassical economists who completely ignore the role of debt in their thinking. But aggregate demand is not just your income, it's your income plus the change in debt. Okay, so that's what enables you to buy the new purchase of commodities, which is largely what GDP is, plus buying existing assets, which is what all the gambling on asset markets is about. So aggregate demand is the sum of GDP plus the change in debt. Now that means that the change in aggregate demand is the change in GDP plus the acceleration of debt. Now what caused the boom was that acceleration was getting faster and faster, and you had rising levels of change in aggregate demand driven by accelerating levels of debt. Then you hit the wall and that acceleration turned into a matter of deceleration and down you plunged. Now, by all the stimulus measures the government's done and trying to encourage people to borrow money again as well, they've slowed down that rate of decline in debt. Now, ironically, the slowdown in the rate of decline of something is an acceleration. When you look at the credit impulse in America, it's now turned positive. But for that to be maintained at a positive level, just like if you're in a car and you're decelerating less rapidly, so you're not slowing down as much, ultimately to keep on doing that, you're going to accelerate again and start going forward rather than backwards. Well, for that to happen in America, for that pulse from credit to remain positive and push growth further, ultimately debt levels would need to rise again. No, I just simply don't believe it's going to happen. Like you're in a Lamborghini doing 350 kilometres an hour, and you slow down to 260, but then you're slowly starting to move, your rate of decline is getting slower and slower, and then ultimately you're going to get faster and faster. You're not going to crack 350. you're going to get to a ceiling and slow down once more. So that fluctuation in the credit impulse is what's been happening in Japan for 20 years. And because the Americans are making the same mistake of not abolishing that debt, they'll continue doing the same fluctuation as well. So they'll rise out and fall back down again. It'll be called a double dip, but by the time it's over, it'll be a quadruple dip.
And few today understand the past and present of this nation better than David McCullough. He is one of the world's most decorated historians, having won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for his biographies of Harry Truman and John Adams.
I've known, to a greater or lesser degree, I think 7 presidents. My understanding, I think, of what weighs on their minds is pretty close. I don't think I could sleep at night if I knew what they know and had all of that on my shoulders. I don't know how many people could sleep at night.
When you look at it, Mr. McCullough, what makes a great president?
The capacity to move the country to do better than it thinks it can with the use of the English language.
Communication is that important?
The power of the written word, the spoken word, very, very important. An ability to stick to your principles, an ability to work with people with whom you disagree and may dislike. I try to stress that exceptional presidents are the exception. We can't expect every president to be a great president. It doesn't happen that way. Life isn't like that. And you can't predict, there isn't a type. They come in all shapes and sizes. Who would have ever thought that Harry Truman would be one of our greatest presidents? And there's no question he was. He said, I never forgot where I came from, who I was, where I came from, and where I would go back to. Now that's a man who knows exactly who he is. He's not craving this adoration and limelight in order to feel good about himself. He didn't want the job. It was thrust upon him. He did not have the gift of moving the country with words the way FDR did or Lincoln did. And he did not have the physical presence that Washington had. I think Washington is our greatest president.
Why?
He set the standards for behavior, integrity, and patriotism of the best kind, not the flag-waving kind, but true love of country. All of our best presidents, without exception, have had a sense of history, and I don't think that's coincidental. And one of the things that a sense of history gives to a person is not just an appreciation and understanding of what happened before we came along, but the realization that we too are part of history, and we too are going to be judged by history. And that's extremely important, that today's polls, tomorrow's headlines are not going to matter. Yeah. What matters, how will you look, how will this time look in time to come?
But you're optimistic at the end of the day.
Yes, I am. I'm optimistic in the long run, principally because of what I see in the generation of my own children and grandchildren and then the students that I meet when I'm lecturing at colleges and universities. I'm distressed. I'm sometimes stunned by how much they don't know about the history of our country. But I know how bright they are, how well-meaning they are, that they want to do the right thing.
Do you think that we have lost some of the optimism and energy that you saw in the 19th century?
Yes, temporarily. I'm a short-range pessimist, a long-range optimist. I think we'll get through these troubles. We've been through worse. When 9/11 happened, people say, oh, this is the worst thing we've ever been through. Yes, it was terrible, but by no means was it the worst we've ever been through. The Revolutionary War, the Civil War, imagine 600,000 people killed. The influenza epidemic, the Great Depression. These were terrible times. I think maybe the darkest time was right after Pearl Harbor. We had no army, half our navy had been destroyed. The Germans were nearly to Moscow. Britain was about finished. And Churchill came across the Atlantic and he gave a speech and he said, we haven't gone this far because we're made of sugar candy. That's the message we need now.
And that's the kind of historical perspective we all need. David McCullough, thank you very much.
Some say any state that holds an election is a democracy. But true democracy requires vigorous political parties allowed to engage in free and lively debate.
There has evolved a political duopoly in the United States in which the two political parties agree to agree on certain things and agree to disagree on others. And in particular, they agree on things related to finance and money, and they disagree on social policy. And this has potentially quite powerful consequences relative to their ability to retain legitimacy in the United States, because the disagreements on social policy are very real and very important. And what you see is both political parties and their candidates and people soliciting money, contributions, from the base of either of the parties, using those social policy issues in order to retain allegiance from the base, even in the face of the two parties' shared agreement to leave the economic and financial issues alone. Now, that duopoly, a sustainable duopoly, depends on the absence both of internal challenges from within the party and also the absence of competitive entry. And I've been speaking about this with people who specialize in the study of political systems and democratic systems. Larry Diamond, for example, at Stanford, who's probably America's leading expert on democracy. And Larry in particular thinks that the lack of a parliamentary system and the lack of ranked order voting are very important necessary conditions to the sustainability of this political duopoly. So why in the face of this is there not a more organized response, either independent of political parties or an attempt to create a third political party? And the answer is that if you look at the recent history of third parties in the United States, particularly those on the left, the last reasonably clean example would be Ralph Nader. What you see is that because of the lack of a parliamentary system and because of the lack of ranked order voting, the effect of a small fraction of the population going to a third party is to defeat the neighboring party in political terms. And so that also serves as a reinforcement to the political duopoly. And my sense in talking with I don't have much contact, I have some with senior people in the Republican Party. I have a fair amount of contact with senior people in the Democratic Party. And my quite strong sense is that this is something that is now explicitly understood. And I think that although it's removed at several levels from the immediate forces that affected the financial crisis and the deregulatory impulses and the lack of law enforcement that allowed the behavior that led to the crisis, I think that ultimately it's some kind of explanation like that you have to rely on. So with that, I will.
I was Assistant Secretary of Housing, so I was the lead regulator for the housing area. And it's very interesting, Max, because I left Washington in 1998, and I kept saying to people, look, they're engineering a housing bubble. This is going to destroy the country. It's going to bankrupt the country. We're talking about a model which is not just fraud. It is the model. It's the plan. It's the governance model. It's the way things are. So there's the official reality that has law, as you and I were brought up to believe it. And then we have a system which believes it's above the law. I mean, I literally had the Secretary of HUD once say to me, look, I don't have to pay attention to the law. I don't have to obey the law. I report to a higher moral authority. So we have the planet run under a model that's operating under a different set of rules and laws that we believe the law to be.
But my attitude is if somebody can't find work and they want to work, we've got to continue to work on expanding the job base. And anybody who wants a job who can't find one means we got a problem. A country which has been under attack can respond by loving your neighbor like you'd like to be loved yourself. America can be changed one heart, one soul, one conscience at a time, so long as we are willing to love a neighbor like we'd like to be loved ourselves. And part of economic security is owning your own home. Part of having a secure America. Part of being a secure America is to encourage home ownership. So somebody can say, this is my home. Welcome to my home. Now, we've got a problem here in America that we have to address. Too many American families, too many minorities do not own a home. There is a home ownership gap in America. The difference between Anglo-America and African-American and Hispanic home ownership is too big. And we've got to focus the attention on this nation to address this. I do believe in the American dream. I believe there is such a thing as the American dream. And I believe those of us who have been given positions of responsibility must do everything we can to spotlight the dream and to make sure the dream shines in all neighborhoods, all throughout our country. Owning a home is a part of that dream. It just is. Right here in America, if you own your own home, you're realizing the American dream. These are all people that I met. They've come over here today. They showed me their home. They didn't show me somebody else's home. They showed me their home. And they are so proud to own their home. And I want to thank them for their hospitality. I want to, because it helps the American people really understand what it means. And what we've got to do is to figure out how to make sure these stories are repeated over and over and over again in America. 3/4 of white America owns their homes. Less than 50% of African Americans are part of the home ownership in America, and less than 50% of the Hispanics who live here in this country own their home. And that has got to change for the good of the country. It just does. And it starts with setting a goal, and so by the year 2010, we must increase minority homeowners by at least 5.5 million in order to close the home ownership gap. We've got to set a big goal for America and focus our attention and resources on that goal. The single greatest barrier to first-time home ownership is a high down payment. It is really hard for many, many low-income families to make the high down payment. And so that's why I've proposed and urged Congress to fully fund the American Dream Down Payment Fund. This will use money, taxpayers' money, to help a qualified low-income buyer make a down payment. And that's important. If one of the barriers to home ownership is the inability to make a down payment, and if one of the goals is to increase home ownership, it makes sense to help people pay that down payment. We believe that the amount of money in our budget, fully approved by Congress, will help 40,000 families every year realize the dream of owning a home. So what I've done is propose what we call a single-family affordable housing tax credit to encourage the development of affordable housing in neighborhoods where housing is scarce. A third major barrier is the complexity and difficulty of the home buying process. There's a lot of fine print on these forms. But we also have got to bring others into the process, most particularly the real estate industry. After all, the real estate industry benefits when people are encouraged to buy homes. It's in their self-interest that we encourage people to buy homes. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, as well as the federal home loan banks, will increase their commitment to minority markets by more than $440 billion. This means they will purchase more loans made by banks to African Americans, Hispanics, and other minorities, which will encourage home ownership. Freddie Mac will launch 25 initiatives to eliminate home ownership barriers. Under one of these, consumers with poor credit will be able to get a mortgage with an interest rate that automatically goes down after a period of consistent payments. To make sure that we achieve a more secure America by achieving the goal of 5.5 million new minority homeowners. In this great country, there are too many people who say this American dream, what does that mean? My eyes are shut to the American dream. I don't see the dream. And we better make sure for the good of the country that the dream is vibrant and alive. It starts with having great education systems for every single child. It means that we unleash the faith-based programs to help change people's hearts, which will help change their lives. It means we use the mighty muscle of the federal government in combination with state and local governments to encourage owning your own home. That's what that means. And it means that each of us have a responsibility in the great country to put something greater than ourselves, to promote something greater than ourselves. And to me, that something greater than yourself is to love a neighbor like you'd like to be loved yourself. In order to change America and to make sure the great American dream shines in every community, we must unleash the compassion and kindness of the greatest nation on the face of the earth. I'm honored to be here today. I want to thank you for your interest. God bless you all, and God bless America.
The great challenge of your life will be how to live out your personal story, pursue your personal dreams, enjoy your personal compassions and compulsions and interests in a world that is getting better, not worse, where the forces of positive interdependence outweigh the negative ones. In that pursuit, I have only two pieces of personal advice. One is you should strive to find happiness every day and not believe it comes at the end of a journey. And most people are happiest doing what they're good at. You have been given the power through your education to pursue what you're good at. The second piece of advice, there is something to be said for not quitting, not giving up, and showing up through the difficult times as well as the easy ones. If you pursue your dreams, you can't quit when you fail, you can't quit when you mess up, and you can't quit when life seems to deal you a tough hand. You have been given the tools to triumph. Now it is up to your will, your mind, and your heart. Now, here's what I want to say about the interdependent world. You have to decide what you'd like the world to look like when your children are sitting where you're sitting today. I know what I want it to look like. I want it to be a world of shared opportunities and shared responsibilities. A world with a sense of deep community across all our differences and a profound obligation to the future. A world where we use the earth that we've been given, but where we do whatever it takes to preserve it for our grandchildren. A world where we celebrate our differences, but we believe our common humanity matters more. Now, if that's the world you want, you have to ask yourself, how do you get it? You must build up the positive and reduce the negative forces raging across our interdependent world and piercing all our net-like borders. What are the most important negative forces of interdependence? The world we live in is too unequal. As you celebrate today your graduation from one of the great universities in this or any nation, there are two things you need to remember. First, college graduates this year will have more personal debt than any class before you. And second, in the last decade, the United States, which still ranks first in the world in the percentage of our young people going on to university, dropped from first to 12th in the percentage of our young people actually achieving four-year college degrees, in no small measure because of a shrinking economy and rising costs. We have to do something about that, but that is a manifestation of growing inequality across the world within and among countries. Second, the world you live in is unstable, not just because violence can cross borders and non-state actors can cause trouble, but because disease can cross borders, because the financial crisis, which sadly began here, spread almost instantaneously, first to the United Kingdom, then Ireland, then Iceland, then to the exporting countries because people couldn't afford to buy their products. We have to find a way to reduce the negative instability of modern life without going to a totally static world where nothing would grow. And finally, the world we live in is unsustainable because of the way we produce and consume energy. We have to find a way to put more people to work by reducing our carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions instead of increasing them. Now, final question. So how do you do that? The only thing I want to say about that today is there is a fundamental difference between the challenge facing the poorest places and the challenges facing the wealthiest. In Haiti, where I spend much of my life now, we just inaugurated a new president. In Africa, in Southeast Asia, and Latin America, where we sell the world's least expensive AIDS and malaria medicines and help to build up health systems, what they need are systems, things you take for granted. They need systems, and a lot of you have worked in places where you see young people just as intelligent as you are, just as hardworking as you are. They simply don't have life chances because they don't have the systems that guarantee good consequences for hard work and good behavior. That is a big challenge. The problem with all countries that have great systems is they get long in the tooth, that they become so successful that those who run them are more interested in holding on to their positions and advancing the purposes for which they were established, more interested in maintaining the gains of the present than achieving even greater ones for our children in the future. For example, I believe America has been hurt badly in the last 30 years by adopting two bad ideas that serve the interest of people who are sitting atop the various totem poles in America today. I was probably the last generation of Americans until the present day who could have gotten an MBA if I'd gone to business school instead of law school, with the prevailing theory being that American corporations had obligations primarily to all their stakeholders. Ever since then, we've been teaching our young people that your primary obligation is only to the shareholders. The problem is if you do that, you ignore the other stakeholders. That could be why wages have been virtually stagnant for 30 years, because the workers are stakeholders. It could be why communities haven't been able to undertake economic transformations in many places, because communities are stakeholders. It could be why customers don't care so much what the source of their purchases are. They're stakeholders. I think we have to move back toward a stakeholder, not just a shareholder-only society in the United States and throughout the world. The second wrong idea is that the only problem America has is that the government, especially the national government, messes everything up that it touches. It would mess up a two-car parade. There is no such thing as a good tax, no such thing as a bad tax cut, no such thing as a good regulation, no such thing as a bad deregulation. That contradicts the evidence in the United States and every other country in the world. The only truly successful countries have both strong economies and effective governments and a public-private partnership to share the future. That is the ultimate answer to this debate going on today. For example, 2012 will mark the year that the Kyoto Accord on climate change expires. In 1997, when the Kyoto Accord was completed, there were 44 wealthy countries that promised to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by a specific amount. Only 4 will certainly make it: Denmark, Sweden, Germany, and the United Kingdom. Before the financial meltdown, all 4 had lower unemployment rates in America, and all 4 had reached their goal in radically different ways, but they did have one thing in common. There was a public-private partnership, a commitment to grow the economy, start businesses, reduce inequality, and prove it was good economics to save the planet for our grandchildren. It is a cautionary tale for the future. So, do what you love and work hard at it and don't quit. Create a world of shared opportunities, shared responsibilities, and a shared sense of community. Believe in this small planet that the only way to win the future is to share it. The only way to share it is to do it in a way that preserves it for our children and grandchildren. And believe that our differences really matter. Think of the remarkably different careers the people who have received honorary degrees have had today. But we all got here because at some level, at critical junctures, what prevailed was an understanding that our common humanity matters more. The Human Genome Project has revealed that we are somewhere between 99.5 and 99.9% the same. That every non-age-related difference you can see in this audience, including gender and race, is rooted in somewhere between 0.1% of our genetic differences. And yet, almost all of us spend 99.5% of our time thinking about the 0.5% of us that is different, even obsessing about it and wishing it were more so. So that is what I leave you with. I wish you well. I think it can be the most interesting time in human history, an age of prosperity and peace and discovery, but only if it is an age of genuine community and sharing. Good luck, and God bless you.
That we are not as divided as our politics suggest. This victory alone is not the change we seek. It is only the chance for us to make that change. And that cannot happen if we go back to the way things were. It can't happen without you, without a new spirit of service, a new spirit of sacrifice. So let us summon a new spirit of patriotism, of responsibility, where each of us resolves to pitch in and work harder and look after not only ourselves but each other.
For as much as government can do and must do, it is ultimately the faith and determination of the American people upon which this nation relies. It is the kindness to take in a stranger when the levees break, the selflessness of workers who would rather cut their hours than see a friend lose their job, which sees us through our darkest hours. What the cynics fail to understand is that the ground has shifted beneath them, that the stale political arguments that have consumed us for so long no longer apply. The question we ask today is not whether our government is too big or too small, but whether it works, whether it helps families find jobs at a decent wage, care they can afford, a retirement that is dignified. Where the answer is yes, we intend to move forward. Where the answer is no, programs will end. And those of us who manage the public's dollars will be held to account to spend wisely, reform bad habits, and do our business in the light of day, because only then can we restore the vital trust between a people and their government. Nor is the question before us whether the market is a force for good or ill. Its power to generate wealth and expand freedom is unmatched. But this crisis has reminded us that without a watchful eye, the market can spin out of control. The nation cannot prosper long when it favors only the prosperous. The success of our economy has always depended not just on the size of our gross domestic product, but on the reach of our prosperity, on the ability to extend opportunity to every willing heart, not out of charity, but because it is the surest route to our common good. To those leaders around the globe who seek to sow conflict or blame their society's ills on the West, know that your people will judge you on what you can build, not what you destroy. To the people of poor nations, we pledge to work alongside you to make your farms flourish and let clean waters flow, to nourish starved bodies and feed hungry minds. And to those nations like ours that enjoy relative plenty, we say we can no longer afford indifference to the suffering outside our borders, nor can we consume the world's resources without regard to effect. For the world has changed, and we must change with it. What is required of us now is a new era of responsibility, a recognition on the part of every American that we have duties to ourselves, our nation, and the world, duties that we do not grudgingly accept, but rather seize gladly, firm in the knowledge that there is nothing so satisfying to the spirit, so defining of our character, than giving our all to a difficult task. This is the price and the promise of citizenship.
What's going to be different in 2012 we've just discussed, which is we will have had 2 years to discuss the budget. Not in the abstract, but in concrete terms. I mean, over the last 2 years, the Republicans have had the benefit of watching us take all these emergency actions, having us have preside over a $1.3 trillion deficit that we inherited, and just pointing fingers and saying, that's their problem. Well, over the next 2 years, they're going to have to show me what it is that they think they can do. And I think it becomes pretty clear after you go through the budget line by line that if, in fact, they want to pay for $700 billion worth of tax breaks to wealthy individuals, that's a lot of money. And that the cuts, corresponding cuts that would have to be made, are very painful. Either they rethink their position or I don't think they're going to do very well in 2012. So I pass a signature piece of legislation where we finally get health care for all Americans, something that Democrats had been fighting for 100 years, but because there was a provision in there that they didn't get that would have affected maybe a couple of million people, even though we got health insurance for 30 million people and the potential for lower premiums for 100 million people, that somehow that was a sign of weakness and compromise. Now, if that's the standard by which we are measuring success or core principles, then let's face it, we will never get anything done. People will have the satisfaction of having a purist position and no victories for the American people. And we will be able to feel
good about ourselves and sanctimonious about how pure our intentions are and how tough we are. And in the meantime, the American people are still seeing themselves not able to get health insurance because of a pre-existing condition, or not being able to pay their bills because their unemployment insurance ran out. That can't be the measure of how we think about our public service. That can't be the measure of what it means to be a Democrat. This is a big, diverse country. Not everybody agrees with us. I know that shocks people. You know, the New York Times editorial page does not permeate across all of America. Neither does the Wall Street Journal editorial page. Most Americans, they're just trying to figure out how to go about their lives and how can we make sure that our elected officials are looking out for us. And that means, because it's a big, diverse country and people have a lot of complicated positions, it means that in order to get stuff done, we're going to compromise. This is why FDR, when he started Social Security, it only affected widows and orphans. You did not qualify. And yet now it is something that really helps a lot of people. When Medicare was started, it was a small program. It grew. Under the criteria that you just set out, each of those were betrayals of some abstract ideal. This country was founded on compromise. I couldn't go through the front door at this country's founding. And if we were really thinking about ideal positions, we wouldn't have a union. So my job is to make sure that we have a North Star out there. What is helping the American people live out their lives? What is giving them more opportunity? What is growing the economy? What is making us more competitive? And at any given juncture, there are going to be times where my preferred option, what I'm absolutely positive is right, I can't get done. And so then my question is, does it make sense for me to tack a little bit this way or tack a little bit that way, because I'm keeping my eye on the long term and the long fight? Not my day-to-day news cycle, but where am I going over the long term? And I don't think there's a single Democrat out there who, if they look at where we started when I came into office and look at where we are now, would say that somehow we have not moved in the direction that I promised. Take a tally. Look at what I promised during the campaign. There's not a single thing that I've said that I would do that I have not either done or tried to do. And if I haven't gotten it done yet, I'm still trying to do it. And so to my Democratic friends, what I'd suggest is, let's make sure that we understand this is a long game. This is not a short game. And to my Republican friends, I would suggest, I think this is a good agreement, because I know that they're swallowing some things that they don't like as well. And I'm looking forward to seeing them on the field of competition over the next 2 years. Thanks very much, everybody.
Don't ask in the lame duck.
You go through 50, 60 years of experience with virtually no declines, and you somehow believe that that's the norm, and it is, except for the crisis that happens once in a century or half-century.
We are in the midst of a once-in-a-century credit tsunami.
That's one of the problems when you're when you have investment basically by committee or by intermediary institutions, where it's not your money, it's potentially your client's money. But what you need is backup of a verifiable source.
And so it's very hard to be the one wise man in a country when everyone believes something that's wrong. We will all believe something is true when it won't be true, and it's going to be very hard to prevent, unfortunately.
But commodities, I think, in the longer run are not going to be attractive if we are in a surplus world, slow growth world. I think there is another recession out there within the next year or two. Now, whether that would be called a double dip or simply another recession, that's sort of a judgment call. The point is, though, that I think now we are on the downside of the long cycle, if you will. there was a tremendous leveraging up, very high growth in the 80s and 90s. That to me ended in 2000. We've been on the downside. Now, we had the tremendous Fed ease and fiscal ease and the big housing bubble that kind of clouded that over. It masked what was going on, but I think we're on the downside. Now, if we're on the downside, we are probably going to see shorter expansions, deeper recessions than we had on the upside. And by the way, that will naturally carry over to other markets like stocks, which tend to mimic the economic cycle. In other words, you would tend to have more frequent bear markets, deeper, weaker bull markets, shorter in duration.
This is a secular bear market that began sometime in 2000 and for all we know is going to run to 2013, 2017, something like that. But what we've been enjoying since March is a cyclical bull market within that secular bear market.
QE1 didn't work, QE2 didn't work, QE12 will not work. When you have an economy that is delevering and you throw liquidity at it, do you think American families are just going to say, oh, we've got a lot of money, let's just go back into debt again, or let's squander our savings? American families have been shocked by the most devastating crisis and recession since the Depression. The idea that you can defer all of this by some massive injection of liquidity is really wrong.
Most financial advisors today are utterly useless in this climate now. So, you know, the buy and hold crowd, the passive allocators, the plop half in equities and hope for the best, all that is rubbish. It's hurt people. It'll continue to hurt people. Not, you know, picking up 2 or 3% dividends with horrendous risk to capital. You know, you'll hear 95% of the people saying that they're buying every day, but if they have no liquidity, if they never told you to sell, if you have no cash, then it's absolutely pointless to tell people that everything's a buying opportunity.
I look forward to seeing you again at one of these conferences where we can be on the same panel and then get away and talk about things we can't even say on the radio.
I'd like to challenge the usefulness not just of new instruments but of large tracts of the whole financial industry, much of which is a net drag. I start with the investment management business because I think intuitively, obviously, you can see that we collectively add nothing. We produce no widgets. We shuffle the existing value of all corporations and bonds around in a cosmic poker game. At the end of each year, the investment community is down by 1% costs, the individuals down by 2%. And aggregate fees have steadily grown. As we grew by 10 times from 89 to 99, huge economies of scale were existing. But the fees per dollar managed grows. No fee competition at all, contrary to theory. Why? Agency problems. Asymmetry of information. The client can't tell talent from luck or risk-taking. And as we add new products, options, futures, CDOs, hedge funds, private equity, aggregate fees rise as a percentage of assets. There becomes a layer of fees and another layer of agents and fees. The more complicated and opaque, the more the client needs us. No wonder Putnam likes this. As fees go up by 0.5%, we reach into the client's balance sheet, snatch the 0.5% and turn it into income. It's almost magic, capital into income. But we lower the savings rate of our clients, savings and investment rate by 0.5% as our fees go up. So we get short-term GDP kick from our income at the expense of lower long-term growth on the part of the system. Similarly with the whole financial system. Let us say by 1965, the best decade we ever had, the 60s, there was a very financial service arrangement. Enough banking, enough letters of credit to get the job done. Adequate tools are vital. That's not the issue. We're talking the razzmatazz of the last 10 or 15 years. The financial system was 3% of GDP in 1965. It's now 7.5%. This is an extra 4% load that the real economy carries. The financial system overfeeds and slows down the real economy. The first 100 years up to 1965, the economy was like a battleship growing at 3.5% a year. Even the Great Depression bounced off it. After 1965, the GDP ex-financials grew at 3.2. After 1982, at 3.1. After 2000, at 2.3. All of these to the end of 2007, not including the current problems. From society's point of view, this 4% works like looting or an earthquake. Both increase GDP short-term, but chew up capital. They might as well be retirees or children, all these extra people in the financial business, but they are much, much more expensive.
Economists have not studied the optimal size for finance. Indeed, a learned journal recently rejected a paper on the grounds that finance does not comment on social utility. That is perhaps why there is so little. The underlying problem recently has been touching faith in capitalism. This faith was based on 50 years of a dominant economic theory that was shockingly not based on facts but on unestablished, unprovable assumptions, rational expectations. This has given us efficient markets. So why regulate new instruments if capitalism and markets are efficient? Or why regulate anything? So Greenspan, Rubin, Summers, and the SEC happily beat back Brooks Libourne trying to regulate new instruments. But as Keynes knew in 1934, markets are behavioral jungles, racked by changing animal spirits and by agency problems. Efficient markets assume symmetry of data on all sides. In real life, agents have all the data, and the principal clients know little. It's like taking candy from babies. The more opaque and complicated the new instruments, the easier the rip-off. There's now at LSE a Center for the Study of Capital Market Dysfunctionality, started by my former colleague Paul Woolley, that is even now attempting in academies to establish that in the real-world condition, agents in finance tend towards getting everything. My God, I finished 56 seconds too early. Well, congratulations. Just consider that I spoke more slowly. Okay.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody.
None, not a single client on the face of the earth knew that all the people in the engine room believed in data that guaranteed a major bear market. How can that possibly be? Are we such a bunch of crooks that we can hold a belief of a disaster and not one client will know that we hold that belief? Had they spoken, however, they would have been fired. And had they managed the accounts that way, they would have been fired. The market's going to come down probably in an orderly manner with animal spirits fairly high and the economy and profit margins doing pretty well. It often happens that way. But if we just go roaring through on a spluttering economy with all the money flowing into speculation the way it does now, the way he's begging us to, incidentally, then come 18 months from now, we're set for another bust, and the piggy bank is empty. If we have another bust, what do we throw at that one compared to the last one or the one before? So career risk creates herding and momentum. Never be wrong on your own, says Keynes. Okay? Just look around, make sure what everyone else is doing. They're buying crazy overpriced growth stocks, jump in, and beat them on the draw. So this has been a wonderful cycle, this Greenspan-Bernanke cycle. Ride the wave and then beat them on the draw on the way down. Go short at the last minute like Goldman and cover your tail. And then ride up again and then leap off and cover your tail a bit and then do it again. And you make fortunes. Unfortunately, the institutions get completely ruined and the pensioners even worse. And the 401ks practically end up owing money that's left. The bad news for us, because we're fairly purist value managers for mainly institutional clients, is we don't like to play games with overpriced assets. And that's the world that we're in now. The Fed is driving the S&P, which is overpriced, the Standard & Poor's 500, a broad measure of the US market. It's driving it from already substantially overpriced into what I would call dangerously overpriced. This is about the boundary line. We expect on a 7-year horizon 1% only plus inflation from the US market. And now as you push it up another 20% perhaps in the next year, it becomes dangerously overpriced, a bubble territory, and ready to inflict considerable pain. That's what we have to worry about. So you're caught between, if you want to be conservative, you've got to start taking counteraction now. If you want to go with the flow, don't fight the Fed, as they say. You should be prepared to speculate on very nimble feet. It's not our style as a firm, but I think it's probably a game that you could play with a pretty good chance of winning for a few more quarters.
A few more quarters, but at some point, or is it today, would you be recommending selling into the rally?
Our institutional clients sell very gracefully into this rally. We've already started to sell. We're not even averagely weighted. We're modestly underweighted. And you must remember, bonds are even worse than stocks on a 7-year forecast. So you get caught in this paradox. It's very tempting, and this is what the Fed wants, by the way. It wants us to go out there and buy stocks which are overpriced because bonds they have manipulated into being even less attractive. So we're being forced to choose between two overpriced assets. That is not always a terrific choice to make, because there is a third choice, and that is don't play the game and hold money in cash. And cash has a virtue that people don't appreciate fully. You don't actually find a strong correlation between top-line GDP growth and making money in the market. It seems like you should. The fastest-growing countries should give you the highest return. They simply don't. But there's only 4 of us that believe that story. Everyone else in the world believes that if you grow fast like China, you'll outperform in the stock market.
If we get housing pricing down, then all bets are off.
That's the biggest risk, it seems.
That to me,
shadow inventory and the real inventory. And the shadow inventory will grow dramatically.
It has grown dramatically.
Yes, there are millions of homes where people have not made any payments on their mortgages in 2 years. And the lenders are not throwing them out because they don't know what to do with the assets. But at some point, if you get another 5 to 10% drop in housing prices, that could really just transform that whole world.
I worry about that.
Yeah.
I'm more worried about that than I am of a double dip, so to speak.
I woke up this morning and none of these was good. And dead machines were rumbling across the ground where Jesus stood. And the man on my TV told me it had always been that way. And there's nothing anyone could do or say. And I almost listened to him. Yeah, I almost lost my mind and I regained the senses again. Looked into my heart to find, and I believe that one fine day all the children of Abraham we laid down their souls forever in Jerusalem. Maybe I'm only dreaming, maybe I'm just a fool, but I don't remember learning how to hate in Sunday school. But somewhere along the way I strayed, and I never went back again. But I still find some comfort now and then.
John 14:6 of the Bible says, "No one comes to the Father except through me."
But saying, "No one comes to the Father except through me," is not the same thing as saying that only Christians can get into heaven. "No one comes to the Father except through me" says only that Jesus decides who does, and who does not, get into heaven. I am sure that if Jesus had wanted to say that only Christians can get into heaven, he would have said that only Christians can get into heaven. But he did not say that. He said only that he will decide who gets into heaven. I will take my chances for now, and simply love my neighbors in the way that Christ commanded be done by all who believe in him.
The Satya Sada, or the true business. And this is really at the heart and soul of Sikhism, that a man cannot think about his relationship with God if he is hungry. And it is our true business to see that our fellow man is taken care of.
Is it skills or luck? Is it nature or nurture? These are questions that don't work. I call them idiotic questions because there's something I call inseparabilities. You cannot separate skills from luck. Skills are necessary, you see, but not sufficient. It is necessary to do some things, okay? So people think I'm saying it's all luck. It's not all luck. There's a large share of luck. Skills are necessary. You cannot have the wild success of J.K. Rowling without some skills. Her books are excellent. Are they the best? I don't know. Haven't seen the other ones. Haven't read the other ones, okay? So skills are necessary, but there's so many people who have these skills, and very few succeed widely. So what I tell people, the distance from zero to middle class, upper middle class, is paved with skills. The distance from zero to a billionaire, is paved with necessary skills and a lot of luck.
Is it, as Lloyd Palmerston said, that nations have no permanent enemies and no permanent allies, only permanent interests? Consider the case of Libya. Just a few years ago, the United States and Libya were locked in a state of hostility. But as Libya has chosen to reject terrorism, to renounce its pursuit of weapons of mass destruction, and to rejoin the international community, the United States has reached out. And today, though we still have our differences, we have nothing to fear from one another. But perhaps nowhere is it clearer that we have no permanent enemies than in our relationship with Russia. The fact is that the United States and Russia are working constructively today on many issues of mutual interest, from counterproliferation to counterterrorism to the pursuit of peace in the Middle East. And we're determined to remember this, even when we hear unwise and irresponsible rhetoric from Russia itself that harkens back to an earlier time.
The U.S. and its allies will do anything they can to prevent authentic democracy in the Arab world. The reason is very simple. Across the region, an overwhelming majority of the population regards the United States as the main threat to their interests. In fact, opposition to U.S. policy is so high that a considerable majority think the region would be more secure if Iran had nuclear weapons. In Egypt, the most important country, that's 80%. Similar figures elsewhere. There are some in the region who regard Iran as a threat, about 10%. Well, plainly the U.S. and its allies are not going to want governments which are responsive to the will of the people. If that happens, not only will the U.S. not control the region, but it'll be thrown out. So that's obviously an intolerable result. The revelations from WikiLeaks that got the most publicity, headlines, euphoric commentary, and so on, were that the Arabs support U.S. policy on Iran. They were quoting comments of Arab dictators. Yes, they claimed to support U.S. policy on Iran. There was no mention of the Arab population, because it doesn't matter. If the dictators support us and the population's under control, then what's the problem? It's like imperialism. What's the problem if it works? As long as they can control their populations, fine. They can have campaigns of hatred. Our friendly dictators will keep them under control. That's the reaction, not just of the diplomatic service and the State Department, or of the media who reported this, but also of the general intellectual community. There's no comment on this. In fact, coverage of these polls is precisely zero in the United States, literally. There's a few comments in England, but very little. It just doesn't matter what the population thinks as long as they're under control. Well, from these observations, you can conclude pretty quickly, pretty easily, what policies are going to be. You can almost spell them out. So in the case of an oil-rich country with a reliable, obedient dictator, they're given free rein. Saudi Arabia is the most important. There were protests. That's the most repressive, extremist, strongest center of Islamic fundamentalism, missionaries who spread ultra-radical Islamism, fund jihadis and so on. But they're obedient. They're reliable, so they can do what they like. There was a planned protest in Saudi Arabia. The police presence was so overwhelming and intimidating that literally nobody even was willing to show up in the streets of Riyadh. But that was fine. The same in Kuwait. There was a small demonstration, very quickly crushed, no comment. Actually, the most interesting case in many respects is Bahrain. Bahrain is quite important for two reasons. One reason, which has been reported, is that it's the home port of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, major military force in the region. Another more fundamental reason is that Bahrain is about 70% Shiite, and it's right across the causeway from eastern Saudi Arabia, which also is majority Shiite, and happens to be where most of Saudi oil is. Saudi Arabia, of course, is the main energy resource, has been since the 40s. By a curious accident of history and geography, the world's major energy resources are located pretty much in Shiite regions. They're a minority in the Middle East, but they happen to be where the oil is, right around the northern part of the Gulf. That's eastern Saudi Arabia, southern Iraq, and southwestern Iran. And there's been a concern among planners for a long time that there might be a move towards some sort of tacit alliance in these Shiite regions, moving towards independence and controlling the bulk of the world's oil. That's obviously intolerable. So going back to Bahrain, there was an uprising, tent city in the central square, like Tahrir Square. The Saudi-led military forces invaded Bahrain, giving the security forces there the opportunity to crush it violently, destroyed the tent city, even destroyed the pearl, which is the symbol of Bahrain. That's very much the Carruthers principle. If actions correspond to our strategic and economic objectives, that's okay. We can have elegant rhetoric, but what matters is facts. Well, that's the oil-rich, obedient dictators. What about Egypt, most important country, but not a major center of oil production? Well, in Egypt and Tunisia and other countries of that category, there is a game plan which is employed routinely, so commonly it takes virtual genius not to perceive it. But when you have a favored dictator, for those of you who might think of going into the diplomatic service, you might as well learn it. When there's a favored dictator and he's getting into trouble, support him as long as possible, full support as long as possible. When it becomes impossible to support him, like, say, maybe the army turns against him, business class turns against him, then send him off somewhere, issue ringing declarations about your love of democracy, and then try to restore the old regime, maybe with new names. And that's done over and over again. It doesn't always work, but it's always tried. Somoza, Nicaragua, Shah in Iran, Marcos in the Philippines, Duvalier in Haiti, Chun in South Korea, Mobutu in the Congo, Ceausescu was one of Western favorites in Romania, Suharto in Indonesia. It's completely routine. And that's exactly what's going on in Egypt and Tunisia. Okay, we support him right to the end, Mubarak in Egypt, right to the end, keep supporting him. Doesn't work any longer, send him off to Sharm el-Sheikh, pull out the rhetoric, try to restore the old regime. That's, in fact, what the conflict is about right now. As Amy said, we don't know where it's going to turn out, but that's what's going on. Well, there's another category. The other category is an oil-rich dictator who's not reliable, who's a loose cannon. That's Libya. And there's a different policy. try to get a more reliable dictator. And that's exactly what's happening. Of course, describe it as a humanitarian intervention. That's another near historical universal. You check history. Virtually every resort to force by whoever it is accompanied by the most noble rhetoric. It's all completely humanitarian. That includes Hitler taking over Czechoslovakia, the Japanese fascists rampaging in northeast China. In fact, it's Mussolini in Ethiopia. There's hardly any exceptions. But so you produce that, and the media and commentators pretend they don't notice that it carries no information because it's reflexive. And then, but in this case, they could also add something else, which has been repeated over and over again, namely the U.S. and its allies were intervening in response to a request by the Arab League, and of course we have to recognize the importance of that. Incidentally, the response from the Arab League was tepid and was pretty soon rescinded because they didn't like what we were doing. But put that aside. At the very same time, the Arab League issued another request. Here's a headline from a newspaper. Arab League calls for Gaza no-fly zone. Actually, I'm quoting from the London Financial Times. That wasn't reported in the United States. Well, to be precise, it was reported in the Washington Times, but basically blocked in the U.S. Like the polls of Arab public opinion, not the right kind of news. So Arab League calls for Gaza no-fly zone. That's inconsistent with U.S. policy. So that we don't have to honor and observe, and that disappeared. Now, there are some polls that are reported. So here's one from the New York Times a couple of days ago. I'll quote it. It said, the poll found that a majority of Egyptians want to annul the 1979 peace treaty with Israel that has been a cornerstone of Egyptian foreign policy and the region's stability. Actually, that's not quite accurate. It's been a cornerstone of the region's instability, and that's exactly why the Egyptian population wants to abandon it. The agreement essentially eliminated Egypt from the Israel-Arab conflict. That means eliminated the only deterrent to Israeli military action, and it freed up Israel to expand its operations, illegal operations in the occupied territories, and to attack its northern neighbor, to attack Lebanon. And shortly after Israel attacked Lebanon, killed 20,000 people, destroyed southern Lebanon, tried to impose a client regime, didn't quite make it. And that was understood. So the immediate reaction to the peace treaty in Israel was that there are things about it we don't like. We're going to have to abandon our settlements in the Sinai, the Egyptian Sinai. But it has a good side, too, because now the only deterrent is gone. We can use force and violence to achieve our other goals, and that's exactly what happened. And that's exactly why the Egyptian population is opposed to it. They understand that, as does everyone in the region. On the other hand, the Times wasn't lying when they said that it led to the region's stability. And the reason is because of the meaning of the word stability. It has a technical meaning. Stability it's kind of like democracy. Stability means conformity to our interests. So, for example, when Iran tries to expand its influence in Afghanistan and Iraq, neighboring countries, that's called destabilizing. It's part of the threat of Iran. It's destabilizing the region. On the other hand, when the U.S. invades those countries, occupies them, half destroys them, that's to achieve stability. And that is a very common, I mean, even to the point where it's possible to write, former editor of Foreign Affairs, that when the U.S. overthrew the democratic government in Chile, and instituted a vicious dictatorship, that was because the U.S. had to destabilize Chile to achieve stability. That's in one sentence, and nobody noticed it because that's correct. If you understand the meaning of the word stability, yeah, you overthrow a parliamentary government, you install a dictatorship, you invade a country and kill 20,000 people, you invade Iraq and kill hundreds of thousands of people. That's all bringing about stability. Instability is when anyone gets in the way.
So, that now takes us to our members open forum. Hi, my name is Shakir, I am a certified general accountant, and I am a Coast Capital Savings member. I have a few critically important concerns I hope you will be able to address. As credit unions are owned by their members, why are credit unions not doing a better job of educating their members when it comes to the damage a secular bear market will do to their life savings? Why are the devastating effects of a secular bear market not properly explained to members who trust the credit union's financial advisors to prudently manage their life savings? Explaining this to investors may not be good for a bank's bottom line, but for a credit union to not explain these risks to the credit union's owners, to me, that is unforgivable. Maybe this is why those that save and invest never actually feel like they're getting ahead. Whereas those that collect handsome fees for managing other people's money seem to have no problem going on 1 or 2 exotic vacations each year. All the vacations that investors have put off, or dreamt of taking in their golden years, never come to be, because these vacations have already been taken by the people that were fortunate enough to have earned such handsome commissions and fees off the life savings of investors, for helping them manage their money more effectively. The chairman of the board tells us that senior management pay is based on the fact that the credit union is now a $12 billion plus financial institution. But, when Surrey Metro, Richmond Savings, and Pac Coast merged, members were told that the reality is, it is easier to succeed as a $10 billion credit union than it is as a $2 billion credit union. At least that was the rationale members were given for the need to merge 10 years ago. How many $12 billion companies are there in Canada where not a single shareholder is allowed to know what the company they own is paying their top executives? Is there anything the owners of a credit union can do to have this information made public? What would it take? What are the hurdles? Another concern I have is that senior management and the board feel that the members have no claim to the hundreds of millions of dollars the credit union has in retained earnings, or the tens of millions in profits the credit union earns each year. Profits which are earned off the backs of the owners of the credit union. They see members as the only skin they have in the game is the $5 they invested to become members of the credit union. Also, senior management has been very successful in bringing down total compensation costs, but this has been done by switching frontline staff to defined contribution pension plans, and away from defined benefit pension plans. This was sold to employees as a positive, as very few people work at the credit union until retirement. And this sounds logical enough. So, what type of pension plan do senior management, all the new, choose to negotiate for themselves? Do they choose instead to go with an even more generous defined benefit plan? If so, why the discrepancy? Mr. Hare, if you could wrap up please. I was hoping you would give me a little extra time as I am here trying to more fairly represent the 99% of the credit union members who are not employees, and who are not here today. No. I will wrap up with one last statement then. Credit unions should be different from the banks because we do not need to take excessive risks to chase profits, or out of fear of losing market share, or falling share prices. Also, credit unions should look to bulk insure mortgages to reduce our exposure to losses that result from a significant rise in foreclosures that we will see once the housing bubble pops. This would still be a lot less costly than the millions that the credit union has lost through the way of bad investments in asset-backed commercial paper. For example, what was the dollar amount, and what was the percentage of the original investment amount lost, in regards to our investments in asset-backed commercial paper? And, what percentage of their bonus did the senior executive responsible for these losses, and the CEO still earn in the years that these losses were incurred? Thank you, Mr. Hare. In regards to senior management compensation, the board that you elect is in charge when it comes to senior management compensation. We establish the compensation and we treat that as strictly confidential. Moving on, is there anyone else who wishes to speak? May I ask a follow-up question? No. This is not a debate. But what are the rules in regards to asking a follow-up question? Discussion is limited to 3 minutes, except the mover may speak a second time to close debate. So, I am allowed to ask a follow-up question, right? No. Is there anybody else who would like to speak? I note that we have had no questions from those watching the AGM online, and other than Mr. Hare, we have only had one other question. May I please ask a follow-up question? I believe you have already spoken. I was hoping you would let me ask a follow-up question considering the fact that this is a $12 billion financial institution and only 2 questions have been asked. With almost 500,000 members, 100 or so who are here at the AGM, and maybe a handful of us who are not credit union employees or board members. I am trying to best represent the interest of the hundreds of thousands of members who are not here today. I will leave it to those in the audience, a vast majority who are credit union employees. Do you want to hear Mr. Hare again, or do you want to adjourn? I think I hear nods for the adjournment. Really? You hear nods for the adjournment? Boy, those employees must be nodding mighty hard. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. The meeting is adjourned.